Be able to have a conversation with Professor Michael Walzer. Most of you must know of him. Today the title of the event is called A Conversation with Michael Walzer, The Implications of Contemporary Global Anti-Semitism. And we're going to have an exchange, a conversation between us, and then we'll open it up for questions with you. So as many of you know, Professor Walzer is Professor Emeritus at the School of Social Science at the Institute for Advanced Studies, the IAS. He's an author, an editor, and lecturer. It's well known. He's been a contributing editor for the New Republic, a co-editor with Michael Kazin of Dissent, member of the board of Hebrew Universities for many years. He taught at Princeton from 1962 to 1966 and Harvard from 66 to 1980. He's well respected on issues in philosophy. He's written such books that had an impact, such as Just and Unjust Wars, Spheres of Justice, The Company of Critics, Thick and Thin, Moral Arguments at Home and Abroad, and On Toleration. So we'll start with a very brief introduction to the issue and some questions that we'll discuss as well. So YIISA, the Yale Initiative for the Interdisciplinary Study of Antisemitism, started in 2006 and interestingly enough became the first research center and the only research center to focus on anti-Semitism at a North American university ever. Many scholars internationally and critics, intellectuals and critics have recently, perhaps since 2001, since 9/11, have seen and claimed to see an explosion of anti-Semitism throughout the world. That people who measure it in a quantified way see increases in incidences, and certainly, on the one hand, the social movement of radical political Islam uses anti-Semitism, and I would argue, in the very conscious words that I'm using now, has adopted a form of genocidal anti-Semitism, particularly when it comes to Israel, Zionism, and Jews in the Middle East that have self-determination. The Jewish people are the only others who have self-determination on what some radical political Muslims, not Islam or Muslims, but political radical Islam would see as Islamic land, and the self-determination of Jewish people is an affront. And the social movement is growing, and genocidal anti-Semitism is at its core. The notion of democracy, enlightenment, human rights, citizenship, I think you argue eloquently for, and many scholars in the West argue for, would be undermined by the social movement. And on the other hand, I would argue, and many people in this field of anti-Semitism would argue, that in the West, in quotations, and particularly on the left, among intellectual circles at universities in Europe and North America, public thinkers, writers, and scholars, I would argue have largely turned a blind eye, have acquiesced to this radical movement, which uses genocidal anti-Semitism as a way of unifying and attracting members and support, that there's been an acquiescence. And I think this would be sort of the terrain that scholars studying anti-Semitism look at and find alarming. So my first question to you, having sort of laid this out in one broad, sweeping statement, my first question would be, radical or political Islam is anti-democratic, it's anti-enlightenment. It's opposed to basic notions of citizenship, to human rights in terms of minority rights, women rights, gay rights, the right of people to dissent, public freedom of expression, free press, and the like. And of course, as I was saying earlier, it's genocidal and it's anti-Semitism. From your perspective, and in light of your important contributions, particularly on notions of toleration and tolerance, accepting the other, what is your response to the social movement at a philosophical level?
Yeah, I'm not sure I have I'm not sure a philosophical response to genocidal anti-Semitism is appropriate. one wants not a philosophical response, but a political response. What is necessary is the political defeat of this kind of politics, and that is a political problem. It's not a philosophical problem. We don't have to explain philosophically what's wrong with genocide. We shouldn't have to. We shouldn't have to explain philosophically what's wrong with anti-Semitism. We have problems. We Jews have problems, which ought to be the problems of other people also, with radical Islam and with certain parts, important parts of the European left. But I wouldn't accept the description of those as philosophical problems. Those are political, ideological, sometimes military problems, but they shouldn't require philosophical discourse. They require something else. They require a political response.
But in your writing on toleration, you write of how it's very important to respect and to include the other, and there has to be a process of inclusion. But you also write, I think, eloquently about how some practices of some cultures are not appropriate for social democracies. There's certain practices that are not acceptable in a democracy. So we have a climate, perhaps I would argue, sort of this postmodern relativist age, where I think some intellectuals would, at a philosophical level, and even filtering down into a political level, want to engage the other no matter what their practices are. So if they happen to be homophobic or anti-women or genocidal and it's anti-Semitism, we still have to engage them and try and bring them into the tent. So how would you instruct maybe these type of thinkers or politicians when it comes to this?
So the question is, what are the limits of toleration? What should be the limits of toleration in democratic societies? And it's a feature of toleration in liberal democratic societies that we tolerate the intolerant. That's one of the things we do. We tolerate people who make arguments against toleration. We tolerate Christian fundamentalists in the United States who make arguments of that sort. We would tolerate Hindu nationalists if they appeared among the American Indian population. So the limits extend beyond the tolerant. They extend to people with whom we have very important disagreements. They don't extend to people who act politically in ways that would deny toleration, would deny the right of peaceful coexistence to others. And we don't tolerate practices that violate the human rights of individuals, either in the communities or in the minority communities in the West or outside of them. So we shouldn't tolerate practices like genital mutilation or the forced marriages of 14-year-old girls, or refusals of education to any part of the population. It's precisely because we are tolerant that we can't tolerate those practices. we want inclusion. We want, let's say, Muslim immigrants to France to become Republican citizens. But if they become Republican citizens, and if they are going to vote in French elections, helping to determine the fate of all French citizens, then they have to, their community has to accept the need for a civic education for all of these future voters, men, boys, and girls alike. If we're going to treat them as citizens, then we have a right. This applies also to ultra-Orthodox Jews in the United States. If they're going to vote in American elections, we have a right to insist that they take courses in their schools on the history of democracy, on the history of the United States, on democratic political theory, on how our political institutions work. And we can impose constraints. We can make demands on any minority community that oppresses its own people, and we make those demands in part because we are hostile to oppression, but also in part because we believe in citizenship, and if we are going to accept these children as citizens, then we have to have a say in their education.
So sticking to France, I find, and just a few days ago, the French government seemed to come a step closer to banning the veil, not the hijab, but the veil in public institutions. And it seems like it's a very complicated and complex process because on the one hand, you have sort of ultra-nationalist, anti-immigrant, Le Pen supporters, I would say sort of racists supporting this. On the other hand, you have, I think, progressive thinkers wanting to protect the rights of women in French society. So how would you view the banning of the veil when it comes
to... We have
to
to define the veil. What is involved here? I don't think we should ban the headscarf any more than I think we should ban the kippah or the turban for Sikhs. But I would find it very hard as a teacher to relate to a student whose face I could never see, and with whom so that I could never be sure when I was having a conversation with her that she was the person I had a conversation with a week ago. So if we're talking about the full cover with just the slit, I think there are good reasons, educational reasons, for refusing to allow that in schools, and possibly also in government offices where people people who have dealings with the bureaucracy would be denied the right of seeing the face of the bureaucrat, and I don't think that's a good idea in a democratic and egalitarian society. But except for that, the full cover, I'm not sure I would want to regulate the way people dress or when they are dressing according to their religious requirements.
And would this approach, which I largely agree with, would this apply just for Western democracies where this is applicable, or would you extend beyond Western democracies in places like Gaza or Iran and impose this, or it's just reserved for people in democracies?
I don't know who... in democracies, we make decisions about these kinds of questions. We make decisions for ourselves and for our fellow citizens. I don't claim any right to make decisions for the people of Iran. I have opinions about what their decision should look like, and I feel free to express those opinions. But I don't, I'm not, until they, well, there are limits here too, but I'm not inclined to impose Western liberal emancipated ways of life on foreign nations. But there are limits. Humanitarian intervention is an imposition. If there's a massacre going on in Darfur, it ought to be stopped, and it ought to be stopped by anyone who has the capacity to stop it. So we can tolerate different kinds of, we can tolerate many forms of oppression in foreign countries. That's the normal pluralism of international society. But we don't tolerate mass murder. We don't tolerate ethnic cleansing. We would not tolerate the mass enslavement of other people. And of course, we should not tolerate threats to other people that come from inside a society. But look, we live with all kinds of religiously imposed inequalities in the United States. Women can't become Catholic priests. The United States government does not interfere. This is an internal affair of the Catholic Church. Ultra-Orthodox Jews do not provide an adequate education, in my view, to their girls. And the United States government does not interfere. So there are things we tolerate, not because we like them, but because it's a liberal society and we don't want the government continually imposing a single set of standards. But there are limits to that toleration.
And this brings me to a point we discussed that some philosophers or thinkers on the left, such as Habermas, have argued that there ought to be some form of accommodation with religion. That there is a notion of religion as decent politics, and it is argued that there could be connections or alliances with some of the evangelical, say, movements on environmental issues, for example, or ways to find political alliances. Is this possible, and can it be progressive somehow in some circumstances?
Yes, well, think back to, some of you aren't old enough to think back to the civil rights movement of the 1960s. In 1960, black students were sitting in at lunch counters in North Carolina. That was the first big moment of the civil rights movement, and the editor of Dissent magazine, Irving Howe, sent me down there, I was a kid, to talk to these students and to write about what was going on in North Carolina. And I came back and told the editors of Dissent, who were ex-Marxists and who were looking for some kind of uprising of black workers and peasants in North Carolina, that this was an uprising of black Baptists, that its heart was in the churches, that the leaders of the movement were Baptist preachers, and that this was not something that we, in the offices of Dissent, understood very well. So there is a history of leftist religion, of radical religion, taking forms that are emancipatory, that are liberating, and that should certainly be supported. Those people were our allies. Now, if gay marriage had been an issue in 1960, those Baptist preachers would not have been on our side. But on civil rights, they were very, very much on our side, and they were the leaders of a movement that Americans, looking back, are probably proud of. So religion is sometimes an ally. And those of us who lived for a long time on the left know how precious allies are, and sometimes how few they are, and how we must find them where they exist and cultivate them. So when there are possibilities of an alliance, if there are evangelical Christians in the United States who believe that we are the stewards of God's creation and that we must preserve it for future generations, I will be perfectly happy to embrace them. And I'm perfectly happy to participate in political meetings where God's stewardship is proclaimed, even though it's not the way I would talk about our obligations to future generations. So those are, I think Habermas is right, that we should seek those alliances, but we seek them when we find religious people who are committed to values like equality, or freedom, or liberation, or environmental integrity, or the value of future, the obligations we owe to future generations. We have to insist on the conditions of our alliances, and that's very, very important.
So would you see different forms of radical or political Islam in terms of accommodating as being different than other religions? Can it be possibly engaged? This is a question, and I think I'm thinking at two levels. One, radical political Islam holds to this view of dimitude, that there's different levels of citizenship, for example. So certain people can never be equal, certain peoples can never be equal, on the one hand. And on the other hand, I was recently at a conference in London at the Tate Gallery, and I was really shocked. It was entitled, the name of the conference was called Don't Look Back, Radical Thinkers and the Arts in the 1900s, and it was put on by the New Statesman and the Tate Gallery. And people like Terry Eagleton, Simon Critchley, Kate Soper, E.L. Weizmann from Israel, and other leading scholars were actually speaking about engagement with political radical Islam. So in our circles of people who study anti-Semitism, we all speak how there's an acquiescence on the left. And sometimes we're always speaking among ourselves. So to be in this environment was actually quite a shock. And they were literally saying that political Islam is opposed to Western hegemony. That's how they can be engaged. Sort of radical Marxist thinkers and political Islam are anti-globalization. They're anti-Western hegemony. They're they have similar views on environmental issues. And that they were really arguing for rethinking and engaging radical political Islam. And I was sitting there really in a state of shock at just the overt way they were speaking. It was almost, from my perspective, like a caricature of what the left has become, but they were actually really articulating it. So how can we on the left actually accommodate a social movement that is so anti-egalitarian? So what's happening to the left if we can't stand up to this?
Well, there really is a prior question. I do want to talk about what's happening to the left, since, as I said a minute ago, I live on the left and argue a lot with my neighbors, but that is where I live. But before we get to that, we need, how should we understand Islamic radicalism? And I think that it's important to understand it in a context that invites comparison. So think of Christianity in the 11th and 12th centuries, the centuries of the crusade, of crusading warfare. Christianity in those years was a crusading religion. And yet, most Christians did not go on crusades. A lot of Christians opposed the Crusades. Some Christian theologians thought that the doctrines of holy war, of crusading warfare, were wrong, even heretical. But the dominant voice in those years was the voice of the Crusade. And that lasted a certain period of time, and then people got tired of crusading, and the Crusaders didn't do all that well militarily, and other voices prevailed. In fact, what we now call the theory of just war is in part a response to the theory of holy war, and it's a critical response, and it comes from within the Christian world. So Islam is in a jihadist phase, the way Christianity was in a crusading phase in the 11th century. Most Muslims, the overwhelming majority of Muslims, are not interested in jihad. Many Muslim theologians oppose jihad and even think that it's a radical misreading, that the radical version of it is a misreading of Islamic theology and history. But the very strong voice, the voice that we hear, is the voice of the jihadists. We shouldn't think of this as an essential feature of Christianity any more than crusading fervor in the 11th century was an essential feature of we shouldn't think of jihadism as an essential feature of Islam any more than crusading fervor was an essential feature of Christianity in the 11th century. It has a history. We hope this history will end at some point. But meanwhile, if you were a Jew in Europe during the years of Christian crusaders, you were in trouble, and you had to think about how to respond. Sometimes by fighting, sometimes by fleeing, sometimes by looking for protection. And in a world where of Muslim jihadism, we have to think of ways of opposing that doctrine. It's not something that we can compromise with any more than you could compromise with Christian crusaders in the 11th century. You have to figure out ways of resisting, and you have to try to persuade other people that this is not an acceptable politics. Now, the maxim which seems to prevail in some parts of the left, that the enemy of my enemy is my friend, is a very bad political maxim because it gets you some very ugly friends. And this is an argument that we have to engage in on the left, insisting that all kinds of alliances are possible. Popular fronts are possible. We are not at this moment in any Western country a majority. I mean, the left, the socialist, social democratic, liberal left. We are not a majority force. So we need alliances. But we need alliances with people who are not committed to kill us, or are not committed to kill some of us, or are not committed to kill our neighbors. We need alliances with people who share basic values. So those people who marched in London during the Lebanon War in '06, saying we are all Hezbollah, they are endorsing a politics which would not tolerate their ostensible beliefs and commitments. And we have to tell them that. and we have to insist on the stupidity, the moral ugliness sometimes, and the simple stupidity of allying with people who do not share any of your most basic commitments. It was a mistake people on the left made with regard to the Iranian Revolution in the late 70s. French thinkers like Foucault, the most famous French thinker of the late second half of the 20th century, were enthusiastic supporters of a revolution that would not, and that predictably would not advance any of the values for which they supposedly stood. And alliances of that sort call into question how firmly you stand for those principles which you are prepared to surrender simply because you see a political force that is anti-American. I suppose that's the crucial way in which radical Islam becomes acceptable to the left. It is anti-American. That's not a good politics. Anti-Americanism is not a good politics. To be critical of the American government for this act and this and this and this, that's a good politics. But anti-Americanism is a terrible politics, as is anti-Zionism.
So just as an antidote at this conference at the Tate Museum, the New Statesman, I had dinner with one of the philosophers there. She's a woman, a very prominent philosopher and a feminist, and she was advocating very strongly to engage and to make an alliance with radical political Islam. And I told her over dinner, you know, what would happen if I was a 75-year-old Anglo-Saxon Protestant man from Oxford University, and I told you to leave the room and go home because you don't belong to, you know, at a professional conference. And she was shocked. And her response after about 30 seconds was that you must be a neocon. I came from the United States, and I must be a neoconservative. And I also come from the left in my work historically, in my life. But it's very interesting that even at Yale University, and certainly in the academy, YIISA is perceived as being neoconservative. Because if you're looking at anti-Semitism in any way, you're fending off enemies of Israel, then you must be on the right, and you must be a Bush supporter, and you must be pro-war, and all sorts of labels are put on us at YIISA. But I think that this acquiescence on the left, here at the Tate Gallery, or some of the, you know, the We Are Hezbollah, or chants of We Are Hamas from the left, are extreme pronouncements. But how do we, in the academy, how do we engage progressive people who are concerned about equality, concerned about human rights? But when it comes to anti-Semitism, when it comes to defending Israel in any way, or even the United States standing up to anti-American tirades, how do we engage our colleagues on the left to deal with this reality? How do we get them to look into the abyss? Because it's coming. I mean, there's a conflict coming. The Iranians, the political Islamists, in their writings, in their teachings, in their sermons, in their policies, are open, they're upfront, they're honest, and we have to respect them for at least that. How do we engage the academy, left-wing, progressive thinkers, to really deal with this issue? Because there's at least a silence, if not a hostility.
One of the things we should talk about, I'm not sure this is an adequate answer to that question, but one of the things we should talk about on the left is what are the legitimate ways of criticizing Israel? What are the boundaries within which criticism can decently take place? And what lies beyond the boundaries? and what is indecent criticism and why is it indecent. And I think, again, I think of questions like that historically. I remember how we criticized France during the Algerian War. The French behaved in Algeria far, far worse than anything Israel has done on the West Bank of Gaza. And we were young critics of French behavior in Algeria. Quite passionate critics. Algeria was the national liberation struggle of the moment, and we were all very strong supporters of the National Liberation Front, the FLN, in Algeria. But we never even thought of calling into question the existence of France or the legitimacy of a French state. No one ever proposed, and we were fierce opponents of this war. No one ever proposed boycotting Israeli, French academics or French universities. No one ever said to me, don't go to France. You can't go to France. In fact, we all wanted to go to France and talk to the people who were fighting against the war, who were struggling politically against the war. So, if you just look back at something like that, you can see what a critical moment can look like, and what it should look like. I think we responded in the right way to the French war in Algeria. And I think again of how people responded to the American war in Vietnam. I grew up politically in the anti-war movement in this country in the 60s. And we were, again, fierce opponents of the American war. We thought it was a criminal war. But we didn't tell people not to come to the United States. We wanted people to come and talk to us about how to oppose the war. We wanted, no one thought of arguing that American product should be boycotted or that America was in some sense an illegitimate state. So there are models of opposition for people who want to oppose the Israeli policies since the '67 war, the occupation and the settlements. There are models of very strong left opposition, which stayed within what I called a moment ago the bounds of decency. And now you have to talk to people on the left who won't go to Israel, but are eager for invitations to go to China. Eager. They solicit invitations to go to China. What China is doing in Tibet is again far worse than anything Israel has done in the occupied territories, and much more successful. The Chinese are actually moving toward creating a Tibet in which the Tibetans are a minority, which the Israelis are not even close to doing on the West Bank. And they are doing it with great ruthlessness. And my friends on the left are quite happy to go to China. And when they go to China, they don't even make a point of looking for activists who oppose what's going on in Tibet. Or that there are Chinese activists who oppose Tibet's policy. But the American left doesn't even engage with them. Why not? Why the focus on Israel requires an explanation, which nobody bothers to give. They treat it as some kind of natural preoccupation. So I have been an opponent of settlement policy since the first settlement was founded, and a vocal opponent both in Israel and here. And it seems to me that that people on the left, the kind of left that we are talking about, really aren't interested in occupation policy or in the Palestinian people or in the creation of a future Palestinian state. They don't give a damn about that. They are interested in the destruction of the state of Israel. And why? And that's a very, very hard question, which we have to insist that they answer so as to expose their own, I don't know, their own craziness, because there's something crazy there.
So just to follow up on me, it's a generational comment, but I was active in the anti-apartheid movement. I was the chairperson of the African National Congress Solidarity Committee of Canada, and was very active for about 10 years in this. But I was active in it, I guess, on a moral level or an ethical level, because when you read the South African Freedom Charter, it was basically a social democratic blueprint for a future South Africa, which guaranteed the rights of all citizens regardless of race and color and gender and the like. But so, and sort of it's a rational decision for somebody who believes in social democracy to accept the South African Freedom Charter. But how do so-called leftists or progressive people accept to support groups like Hamas when their charter is very clear in not only advocating segregation and differentiation of citizenship, but literally calling for the killing of Jews in their constitution?
I don't think they read it. Yes.
And to go to one of the last questions before we open it up. So how do you perceive the so-called new or contemporary forms of anti-Semitism? Can this point to a crisis of modernity? Radical Islam's anti-Semitism and the inability of the West to mount a significant response to it, at least at an intellectual or philosophical level. And in this context, I'm reminded of the whole issue of Iran. Iran is clear in its incitement to genocidal anti-Semitism. As I said earlier, it's clear, open, honest, it's straightforward. Its intent on building a nuclear weapons program to destroy Israel has been articulated many times from Ayatollah Khomeini to Ahmadinejad's Iran or regime. It's using the protocols of the elders of Zion in a way that I would even argue may be more dangerous than its nuclear weapons program, which is, I think the use of this narrative is beginning to have traction in South America and parts of Africa and even the United States. And yet, some scholars, and even scholars that deal with anti-Semitism, speak of this as some sort of issue, that it's a translation issue, there's this misunderstanding, that I would argue that there's almost a denial. There's a fear of looking into the abyss. Why do you think there's this denial, if it exists among scholars and even human rights activists who refuse to deal with this issue? To confront anti-Semitism and the denial of human rights, the stealing of elections, the closing down of freedom of expression, etc., and to even blame those engaged in the issue as being neoconservative or exacerbating the crisis. Why do you think this is going on?
Yeah. Well, I don't like to talk about a crisis of modernity. I'm not sure what phrases like that mean. There is a failure of Western liberals. Leave the left aside for the moment. There's a failure of Western liberals to accept the ideological burdens of liberalism. It's not the right is prepared to go to war. Sometimes in places where we shouldn't go to war. They are prepared to fight, and liberals don't like fighting for good reasons, among other reasons, for some very good reasons. Liberals don't like fighting, And so they think that they have to be accommodationist and conciliatory and to look for forms of coexistence even with groups that are not prepared actually to coexist. And what has been lost among liberals is any sense that there are, and these may be, as you just suggested, these are more important than the military conflicts. There are intellectual and ideological conflicts. There is we are engaged right now in an ideological struggle with radical Islam above all, sometimes with other forms of religious radicalism, with Hindu nationalism or Messianic Zionism in the settler movement. But we are engaged in, secular left, liberal Democrats, we are engaged in an ideological struggle. We are not, there are too many of us are not prepared to accept the burdens of that struggle. And those burdens involve precisely engaging at every moment with the arguments or the pseudo-arguments or the false histories that are proclaimed by these religious zealots.
Do you think that that's why perhaps there's an increase of anti-Semitism, particularly on the left? Because there's also a tradition in liberalism to blame the victim. And if Israel and the Jews are the victim of radical Islam's genocidal anti-Semitism, there's only 6 million Israelis in this small country. There's potentially many more enemies if you look into the abyss of political radical Islam. Is it easier on the left to blame Israel than to look at this significant problem that's facing us?
I think there's a much more dangerous and prevalent tendency among some leftists, which is not to blame the victim, but to support the powerful. What is it that drove the left's admiration for an alliance with Stalinist Russia? It wasn't blaming the victim. It was a belief that this was an enormously powerful force which had, so to speak, history at its back, or I don't know, that had a certain inevitability in its development, and people on the left wanted to be on the side of this rising historical force. And disillusion with Stalinist Russia produced a new wave of illusion about Maoist China. For similar reasons, when you are, as Western leftists have often been, weak, you look with admiration to people who call themselves leftists and are in power, and who have great strength. So I've recently been reading some stuff about the Moscow trials of the 1930s, which were farcical, right? The confessions were like the confessions we saw in the Iranian trials a few months ago. All the evidence was made up. The confessions were recited by men who had been tortured or whose families had been threatened. The spectacle was horrifying and disgusting, and yet many Western leftists thought that there must be guilt here because these were the defeated revolutionaries. And the triumphant revolutionaries were the ones we had to support. The French philosopher Merleau-Ponty, in his book Humanism and Terror, argued that the charges against the defendants in the Moscow trials might be, probably were, historically false, but they were politically true. Historically false, but politically true. This is the dialectic. And politically true because these guys had lost. So I think there are other pathologies on the left than blaming the victim.
Is there a drift to this sort of openness to embracing the Islamic world? Is there a drift in Washington towards this?
That I don't know. President Obama continues to talk, as he did last night, in very, very strong terms about Iran. I don't know what the diplomatic or political follow-through is going to be. I'm not an insider in Washington.
So one final comment, and we'll open it up for discussion. Given the Iranian regime's view of Israel and the self-determination of Jewish people on so-called Islamic land, from their worldview, is Israel morally justified to attack Iran? Would it act immorally if it did not attack Iran and protect its citizens from an imminent threat of a nuclear weapons program?
You don't ask easy. War is supposed to be, military attacks are supposed to be a last resort. That's one of the features of just war theory. And there's difficulty with the idea of a last resort. Lastness is a metaphysical term. You really never get there because there's always something more that you can do before you get the last thing. For one thing, you can always do again what you did before, which is what politics is all about. Try again. So last resort is a peculiar phrase, but what it does suggest is that the use of force should not be a first resort or an early resort. There are lots of things that have to be done before, or that have to be tried before the use of force can be justified. And I think we are probably some distance away with regard to both the United States and Israel. We are some distance away from confronting that question of whether the use of force is justified. And then there is the question of whether it's possible. One of the features of, another one of the criteria for a just war is that there has to be a strong probability of success, which may not exist in this case. And then there also has to, you have to meet the proportionality rule. You can't attack in ways that kill or endanger very large numbers of Iranian civilians. So there are many, many hard questions here. And what we all know is that if it looks as if there is a government in Iran ready to actually use nuclear weapons, then the job of stopping them belongs to the United States. And the responsibility to stop them belongs to the United States and not to Israel. Partly because we have the ability to do it. But this is not anything we should be in a hurry to do. Now, you also have to think about what a deterrence regime would look like. Suppose they get nuclear weapons, a small number of nuclear weapons. What would happen then? There would be Israeli submarines in or near the Persian Gulf with nuclear weapons on hair trigger alert. And that would probably be an effective deterrent, but no one in the world should want a situation like that. It will not be anywhere near as stable as the American-Russian deterrent regime. And so it shouldn't be. It should not be only the Israelis. This should be a constant theme of ours. It should not be only the Jews who worry about anti-Semitism. It should not be only the Israelis who worry about Iranian radicals.
So I have to make one final point, though. So that the West, particularly Europe, Italy, Germany, and France in particular, and other European countries, are actually engaged in trade and subsidizing trade in some cases, in the case of Germany, to support the nuclear weapons program. So what I mean, so politically and morally, there's all sorts of what is.
Yeah, but it's also not clear that the United States has made any major diplomatic, serious, sustained diplomatic, political effort to persuade the Europeans that they shouldn't be doing that.
Okay, so thank you very much. I can ask many more questions, but in the spirit of democracy.
So since I'm one of the people who is not a Zionist, an American, Jewish, liberal, cosmopolitan, perhaps I can explain why it is, what one of those people actually thinks. Of course, only one, and one who is very much a progressive, self-described, and interested in ideological discussion.
But my position is basically informed by proofs. The American policies the last N years, where N is not the Bush administration, but since our decision to put our bets on Saudi Arabia, who I take it is funding with our complicity much more of the activities that you're disliking than the Germans are. But let's just begin sort of toward the end and say, well, you know, we have, if you were an Iranian and you saw the Americans invade Iran and Afghanistan, Iraq and Afghanistan, and declare their intention of regime change, and you saw them looking at North Korea, and not doing anything because they have a couple of bombs. And you observe that the Israelis have nuclear weapons. You notice that? Well, I have. But you know, but all of this is, you know, sort of as if, how in the world can anyone have some problems? You know, these radicals have no problem. One would think that the Americans should exercise a certain degree of prudence. We have destroyed our moral authority in the Islamic world. And the idea that we are going on a jihad for Western values with our friends, the Saudi Arabians, for the freedom-loving peoples of Iraq and Afghanistan, The question is, isn't this the framework that we should consider the question of whether the Americans should conceivably attack Iran?
Okay. I will respond without the melodrama. Is that okay? Okay. First of all, I think it is very important to confront the fact that Israel has nuclear weapons. But then it's also very important to recognize that no country in the Middle East is threatened by Israeli nuclear weapons or feels threatened. No government in the Middle East thinks that it is about to be attacked and its people, its national existence destroyed because Israel has nuclear weapons. They all know that Israel would use those weapons only if it is attacked in a way that threatens its existence. And that's not my idea. That is common knowledge.
America, whether America should.
Okay, but I just want to get that straight. It is common knowledge throughout the Middle East. No one in Israel wants to destroy the Iranian people or the Iranian Republic, even the Iranian Islamic Republic. So that's just very important. Now, the American record in Iraq and Afghanistan is very bad. I agree entirely. I thought the war in Iraq was unjust, wrong from the first time it was suggested, and I thought the war in Afghanistan was conducted unjustly, although I think we had a right to go in there after 9/11. And so yes, we have lost a lot of credit in the Arab or the Islamic world. Nonetheless, the truth is, a successful attack on Iran's nuclear capacity